Padre Pio once spoke of a soul who believed confession was enough, and this story unsettled even those closest to him because it exposed a misunderstanding so common, so quiet, that it rarely alarms the conscience until it is too late. The man who came to him did not arrive in panic or desperation. He arrived with calm certainty, kneeling in the confessional with the assurance of someone who believed the ritual itself guaranteed peace, listing his sins carefully, methodically, without tremor in his voice, without the weight of sorrow that usually accompanies a soul aware of its own fragility. Those who later reflected on the moment said it was this confidence, not the sins themselves, that first troubled Padre Pio, because he understood that true repentance always carries a wound, a humility that does not rush to be finished. As the confession continued, Padre Pio fell silent, the way he often did when something deeper was unfolding, and the silence grew heavy enough that it unsettled the man, who began to shift, unsure why the priest had not yet spoken the words of absolution he expected. Padre Pio finally said that something essential was missing, that the confession was incomplete, not because of forgotten details, but because of a deliberate withholding, and the man immediately protested, insisting he had confessed everything, insisting that nothing remained hidden. And yet Padre Pio described the concealed sin with precise clarity, not in vague accusation, but in exact circumstance, time, and intent, revealing that the sin was not merely an action, but an attachment the man refused to surrender. Witnesses later recalled that the man's face drained of color because he realized in that moment that the priest before him was seeing beyond words, beyond rehearsed confessions, into the interior posture of his soul. Padre Pio explained that confession is not a transaction that erases guilt by formula, but a surrender that transforms the heart. And without contrition, absolution becomes empty words spoken over a locked door. He warned that God's mercy is infinite, but it does not force entry where pride stands guard, and that a soul which hides even one grave sin is not protecting itself from judgment, but choosing isolation from grace. What made this encounter especially disturbing was what Padre Pio later confided to his spiritual sons, that during this confession he was shown the soul as it truly stood before God, outwardly religious, disciplined, certain of its standing, yet inwardly fractured, clinging to a single refusal that poisoned everything else, a soul convinced it was healed while still bleeding beneath the surface. Padre Pio said this illusion was one of the greatest dangers a believer could face because fear of judgment can lead a soul to humility, but certainty without self-examination leads it quietly away from God. He often repeated that hell is not filled only with those who hated God, but with those who no longer felt they needed him, and that this man's soul frightened him not because of violence or rebellion, but because of its calm self-assurance. Padre Pio explained that confession without repentance is not merely ineffective, it becomes dangerous because it trains the soul to mistake religious routine for conversion, and over time this habit hardens the heart, making true repentance increasingly difficult. He said that many souls drift toward ruin not through dramatic sin, but through repetition of half-truths, partial admissions, and justifications that slowly dull the conscience until silence feels like peace. The man confronted with this truth initially resisted, arguing inwardly, struggling between shame and pride, because admitting the hidden sin would shatter the image he had constructed of himself as faithful, respectable, and safe. Padre Pio waited without anger because he understood that grace works in patience. And finally the man broke, not in despair, but in tears, confessing the sin he had withheld, confessing not only the act, but the attachment, the excuse, the way he had carried it quietly while convincing himself it no longer mattered. Only then did Padre Pio grant absolution, and afterward he warned the man with unusual seriousness that had he left earlier, believing himself forgiven, he might have carried that lie until death, and the consequences would not have been imposed by God, but chosen by the soul that refused truth. Padre Pio later said this encounter haunted him because it revealed how easily a soul can deceive itself while remaining outwardly devout, praying, confessing, receiving sacraments, yet never allowing God to touch the one place it fears surrender. He insisted that God does not ask perfection, but he does ask honesty, and that weakness confessed is never dangerous, but pride disguised as piety is. He often told those who sought easy reassurance that the devil does not need to stop people from confessing if he can convince them to confess falsely, because a confession that costs nothing heals nothing, and a soul that refuses to be humbled cannot be healed. Padre Pio explained that hell is not entered by accident, nor is it the result of a single failure, but of a direction slowly chosen through repeated refusals, each one small, each one justified, until the soul becomes settled in self-sufficiency. He said judgment does not introduce new truth. It reveals the truth the soul has been practicing all along, whether openness or resistance, humility or defense. What frightened him most about the vision he saw was not the presence of sin, but the absence of sorrow, because sorrow indicates life, movement, desire for mercy, while indifference signals closure. He warned that a soul that still feels disturbed, unsettled, uncomfortable with its own condition is still responsive to grace, but a soul that feels secure without self-examination is in grave danger. Padre Pio emphasized that confession is meant to reopen the soul, not to seal it in comfort, and that mercy flows instantly when truth is surrendered, no matter how long it has been withheld. The man who confessed fully that day left shaken but free, aware for the first time that salvation is not maintained by appearances but by ongoing humility. And Padre Pio said that this was the true mercy of God, not the avoidance of discomfort, but the rescue of the soul from its own illusions. He urged others who heard the story to examine not how often they confess, but how honestly, not how religious they appear, but whether they still desire to be changed, reminding them that the most dangerous lie a soul can believe is not that God will not forgive, but that nothing more is required. In the end, Padre Pio's warning was not meant to terrify, but to awaken, because as long as a soul still desires truth, still fears self-deception, still longs for mercy, the door remains open. But the moment confession becomes routine instead of surrender, the soul begins to drift, quietly, politely, and without realizing it, away from the very grace it believes it possesses.